Quentin, you're under arrest. You have the right to remain silent.
I understand my rights. I want to call my lawyer.
You'll get your call at the station. Let's go.
This is a mistake. I didn't do anything.
Tell it to the judge. In you go.
I know my rights. I'll be out soon.
A freezing Tuesday evening, a solitary man waiting for a bus, a patrol car slowing to a predatory crawl. It's a scene that plays out thousands of times across America. But this time, the officer picked the wrong target. He thought he was locking up a nameless, defenseless suspect. He had no idea he had just forcefully handcuffed one of the most ruthless, high-ranking federal prosecutors in the district. This is the story of a wrongful arrest, a shattered badge, and a $4.7 million mistake. Quentin Whitaker was a man who traded in the currency of control. At that stage in his career, he served as the deputy chief of the Violent Crimes and Racketeering Section at the United States Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. That Tuesday, he had spent the day meticulously dismantling a multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate in front of a federal judge. His suit was perfectly pressed, his arguments razor-sharp, his authority absolute. When Quentin spoke, FBI special agents took notes. When he frowned, defense attorneys reconsidered their plea deals. He was a man insulated by the immense, crushing weight of the federal government. But the federal government couldn't fix a dead alternator. Deep in the subterranean parking garage of the federal courthouse, Quentin turned the key of his normally reliable Audi A6, only to be met with the agonizing, rapid-fire clicking of a dead battery. He sighed, resting his forehead against the leather steering wheel. The day had been an exhausting marathon of cross-examinations and sidebar arguments. He was utterly drained. A tow truck would take hours. He decided to leave the car, walk a few stops, and catch the bus the rest of the way to his home in Brookline. Before leaving the office, Quentin had stripped off his armor. The tailored Tom Ford suit jacket, the silk tie, and the crisp dress shirt were packed neatly into his leather messenger bag. In their place, he wore a faded gray Harvard Law hoodie, dark sweatpants, and a black wool beanie. Pulled low against the biting November wind, he looked nothing like the legal titan who had just commanded a courtroom. He looked like an ordinary, tired man trying to get home. The wind whipping off the Charles River was brutal. Quentin stood at the poorly lit bus stop at the corner of a gentrifying neighborhood that straddled the line between affluence and urban decay. The streetlights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the icy pavement. He checked his phone. The bus was running late. He shoved his hands deep into his hoodie pockets, shifting his weight to stay warm, his breath pluming in the freezing air. 3 blocks away, Officer Vance Carver was nursing a lukewarm coffee in a foul mood. Carver was a veteran of the local police department, a man whose career had stalled at the rank of patrolman due to a long, quietly buried file of citizen complaints. He was cynical, restless, and deeply annoyed by the night's assignment. There had been a string of residential burglaries in the area over the past few weeks. The suspect description broadcast by dispatch was frustratingly vague, the kind of dangerously broad net that invited lazy policing. Male, black, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing dark winter clothing. In a city of hundreds of thousands on a night when the temperature hovered near freezing, that description fit half the men walking the streets. But Carver wasn't looking for nuance. He was looking for an arrest to get his lieutenant off his back. He turned his cruiser onto the avenue. The street was mostly empty, save for the occasional passing car and a lone figure standing by a bus shelter. Carver's eyes narrowed. He slowed the cruiser, the heavy tires crunching over patches of frozen slush. He took in the sight, a black man, tall, wearing a dark hoodie and a beanie, hands concealed in his pockets, standing in the shadows. To Quentin Whitaker, the approaching headlights were just a passing car. But as the vehicle decelerated, a blinding, high-intensity spotlight suddenly hit him square in the face. Quentin squinted, raising a gloved hand to shield his eyes. The vehicle was a police interceptor. The engine idled with a low, menacing rumble. Quentin felt a flicker of annoyance, but no fear. Why would he? He was a top-tier officer of the court. He assumed the officer was just doing a routine check, perhaps going to ask if he had seen anything suspicious. The driver's side door swung open. Officer Carver stepped out, his hand resting casually but purposefully on the butt of his holstered service weapon. The heavy thud of his boots on the asphalt broke the quiet of the night. "Hey," Carver called out, his voice carrying the sharp, jagged edge of practiced authority. "Step out of the shelter. Keep your hands where I can see them." Quentin didn't immediately move. He was processing the command, his brilliant legal mind automatically analyzing the interaction. This was a Terry stop, an investigative detention. Under the Fourth Amendment, the officer needed reasonable, articulable suspicion that a crime had been, was being, or was about to be committed. Standing at a bus stop was not a crime. "I said, get your hands out of your pockets and step into the light," Carver barked, closing the distance. Quentin slowly withdrew his hands, making sure his palms were open and empty. He stepped forward into the harsh glare of the spotlight. "Officer," Quentin said, his voice calm, measured, and entirely devoid of the panic Carver was used to hearing. "I'm just waiting for the bus. It's supposed to be here in a few minutes. Is there a problem?" "I'll ask the questions," Carver snapped. He stopped about 4 feet away, shining his heavy mag light directly into Quentin's eyes despite the spotlight already illuminating the area. "What are you doing out here?" "I just told you. I'm waiting for the bus," Quentin replied, his tone remaining even, though a deep, simmering frustration began to take root in his chest. "My car broke down downtown." "You live around here in Brookline?" Carver demanded. "Got any ID on you?" This was the pivot point, the moment where the law separated the citizens from the subjects. Quentin knew the statutes of the state perfectly. It was a stop and identify state, but only if the officer had reasonable suspicion of a crime. Quentin was a black man in a hoodie, yes, but he was also a man who had dedicated his life to upholding the Constitution. He decided to establish the legal baseline. "Officer," Quentin said, politely but firmly, "before I reach into my bag for my identification, could you please tell me what reasonable suspicion you have to detain me? Am I suspected of committing a crime?" The question hung in the freezing air. To Quentin, it was a standard procedural inquiry. To Officer Vance Carver, it was an act of profound, unforgivable disrespect. Carver's jaw tightened. The subtle shift in the officer's body language was instantaneous. The casual arrogance morphed into aggressive hostility. In Carver's world, people on the street didn't use terms like reasonable suspicion. If they did, they were either sovereign citizens or smart Alex looking for a fight. Carver despised both. "I don't need to give you a law lesson, buddy," Carver sneered, taking a step closer, invading Quentin's personal space. The smell of stale coffee and peppermint gum wafted off the officer. "We've had burglaries in this area. You fit the description. Now you're going to give me your ID, or I'm going to take you in for obstruction, your choice." Quentin's mind raced. Fit the description. The oldest, most legally fragile excuse in the book. A vague description of a suspect does not grant law enforcement carte blanche to detain anyone who matches the race and gender of the suspect, especially absent any other suspicious behavior. Quentin knew that if he were a white man in a suit, this conversation wouldn't be happening. "I understand you're doing your job, officer," Quentin said, keeping his voice carefully modulated, avoiding any sudden movements. "But standing at a marked public transit stop is not suspicious behavior. I am declining your request for identification, as is my Fourth Amendment right, and I would like to know if I am free to go." Am I free to go? The magic words in a courtroom. Those words established whether a person was legally seized. Carver's face turned an ugly shade of red. He wasn't used to being calmly outmaneuvered on the sidewalk. He was used to fear, compliance, or belligerence, all of which he knew how to handle with force. This cold, clinical defiance infuriated him. "You're not going anywhere," Carver growled. Without warning, he lunged forward, grabbing Quentin by the upper arm with a bruising grip. Quentin gasped in shock, instinct causing his muscles to stiffen. "What are you doing? Do not touch me." "Stop resisting," Carver yelled, the phrase a pre-programmed defense mechanism meant for his body camera and any potential witnesses. He yanked Quentin forward, spinning him around and slamming him chest first against the cold plexiglass wall of the bus shelter. The impact knocked the breath out of Quentin. The sheer indignity of it, the physical violation, sent a surge of adrenaline through his veins. His cheek was pressed against the freezing, grime-covered glass. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the bus finally pull up to the corner, its pneumatic brakes hissing. The doors opened, and a handful of passengers stared in wide-eyed horror at the scene. A police officer roughly subduing a black man in a hoodie. "I am not resisting," Quentin stated loudly, ensuring his voice was clear for the officer's microphone. He deliberately went limp, offering absolutely zero physical opposition. He knew the statistics. He knew how quickly a bruised ego with a badge could turn a sidewalk into a crime scene. He would fight this, but not in the street. He would fight it in the arena he owned. Carver kicked Quentin's legs apart, patting him down with unnecessary aggression. "Got a weapon on you? Needles? Anything that's going to poke me?" "I have no weapons," Quentin said, his voice muffled by the glass. "You are making an unlawful arrest. I am advising you to stop." "Shut your mouth," Carver spat. He unclipped his handcuffs. The cold steel ratcheted tightly around Quentin's wrists, pinching the skin. The click of the locking mechanism echoed in the quiet street. Quentin Whitaker, the man who had authorized the wiretaps of international drug lords, the man who had the direct cell phone number of the Attorney General of the United States, was now handcuffed like a common vagrant. Carver grabbed the thick leather strap of Quentin's messenger bag, yanking it off his shoulder, and then marched him toward the cruiser. "You wanted a law lesson? How about a lesson in respect?" Carver muttered, opening the back door of the Interceptor. He placed a heavy hand on Quentin's head and shoved him into the cramped, hard plastic back seat. The door slammed shut, trapping Quentin in the suffocating dark interior of the police car. It smelled of old sweat, vomit, and heavy industrial cleaner. He shifted his weight, the handcuffs biting into his wrists with every movement. Through the metal mesh of the partition, he watched Carver confidently stride to the driver's side, clearly proud of his proactive police work. Carver got in, picked up the radio microphone, and keyed it. "Dispatch. I've got one in custody. Matches the description of the burglary suspect. He's being uncooperative. Transporting to the precinct for booking." Carver looked at Quentin through the rearview mirror, a smug, self-satisfied grin on his face. "Hope you didn't have any big plans tonight, counselor." Quentin sat in the darkness, the shock beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. He looked back at Carver's eyes in the mirror. "Officer," Quentin said softly, his voice carrying the chilling certainty of a judge delivering a life sentence. "You have no idea what you've just done." Carver just laughed, threw the cruiser into drive, and sped off toward the station. The ride to the precinct was a masterclass in psychological endurance. Carver took the turns sharply, deliberately tossing his handcuffed passenger back and forth across the slick plastic seat. Quentin braced himself as best he could, refusing to give the officer the satisfaction of a complaint. Instead, Quentin cataloged everything: the street names they passed, Carver's badge number, which he had memorized the second the spotlight hit him, the exact phrasing of Carver's threats. Quentin's mind was a steel trap, building a federal civil rights lawsuit piece by meticulous piece. The cruiser pulled into the secure sally port of the precinct. The heavy steel garage doors rattled shut behind them. Carver hauled Quentin out of the back seat by the chain of the handcuffs, a tactic that sent a sharp spike of pain through Quentin's shoulders. "Walk!" Carver commanded, pushing him through the heavy, reinforced doors and into the chaotic, fluorescent-lit booking area. The precinct smelled exactly like desperation. It was a cacophony of ringing phones, shouting officers, and the low, defeated murmurs of the recently arrested. At the raised wooden booking desk sat Sergeant Lyle Beaumont, a tired, overweight desk sergeant who looked like he was counting the seconds until his pension kicked in. "What do we got?" Beaumont asked, not looking up from his computer monitor. "Caught our prowler," Carver announced proudly, bringing Quentin to a halt in front of the desk. "Spotted him loitering at the bus stop. Matched the description to a T, refused to ID, got mouthy, tried to hit me with a bunch of constitutional stuff. I'm writing him up for obstruction and resisting, and we can let the detectives see if they can tie him to the break-ins." Beaumont sighed, finally looking up. He took in Quentin's appearance. The beanie, the hoodie, the handcuffs. "All right, put him on the wall. Empty your pockets, buddy." Carver roughly patted Quentin down, pulling out his keys, a pack of gum, and his cell phone. He then grabbed Quentin's expensive leather messenger bag and unceremoniously dumped its contents onto the booking counter. Out tumbled the neatly folded Tom Ford suit jacket, the silk tie, a few legal pads covered in dents, illegible notes, and a thick, heavy leather wallet. "Take his beanie off," Beaumont instructed. Carver snatched the wool cap off Quentin's head, messing up his closely cropped hair. Quentin stared straight ahead, his expression carved from stone. He was playing the long game now. If he screamed and shouted about who he was, they would accuse him of trying to use his position to escape a lawful arrest. No, Quentin was going to let the system they abused so freely crush them under its own weight. "Name?" Beaumont asked, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Quentin remained silent. "Hey," Carver barked, slapping the back of Quentin's head, a casual degrading strike. "The sergeant asked you a question." Quentin slowly turned his head to look at Carver. The intensity in Quentin's eyes was so profound, though utterly devoid of fear, that Carver unconsciously took a half step back. "I am invoking my right to remain silent," Quentin said, clearly to Sergeant Beaumont. "I will not answer any questions. I want my phone call." Beaumont rolled his eyes. "Another amateur lawyer. Fine. Put him in holding cell 3. I'll log his property." Carver grabbed Quentin's arm and led him away from the desk, down a dingy, green-tiled hallway. He shoved Quentin into a cramped, foul-smelling cell containing a metal bench and a lidless toilet, uncuffed him through the bars, and slammed the heavy iron door shut. The deadbolt echoed with a final metallic clang. "Get comfortable," Carver sneered through the bars. "You're going to be here a while." Quentin rubbed his raw, red wrists. He sat down on the cold metal bench, closed his eyes, and began to wait. Back at the booking desk, Sergeant Beaumont was annoyed. He hated logging property for uncooperative suspects. It meant more paperwork. He began sorting through the items scattered on the counter. He cataloged the cell phone, noting it was a high-end model. He logged the keys. He picked up the Tom Ford jacket, his fingers brushing against the luxurious fabric. Weird clothes for a burglar to be carrying around, he thought vaguely, but didn't dwell on it. Finally, he picked up the heavy leather wallet. It wasn't a standard bifold. It was thicker, secured with a small brass snap. Beaumont popped the snap open to look for a driver's license so he could properly identify their John Doe. As the wallet fell open, Beaumont didn't see a driver's license. He saw gold. A heavy, intricate gold shield gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the precinct. Above the shield, stamped in brilliant gold foil into the leather, were the words, "United States Department of Justice." Beaumont's breath caught in his throat. His heart skipped a beat. His hands began to tremble slightly as he flipped the leather flap to reveal the identification card opposite the badge. It featured a stern professional photograph of the man currently sitting and holding cell 3. Next to the photo, bold black letters spelled out United States Department of Justice, Quentin Whitaker, Assistant United States Attorney, Deputy Chief, Violent Crimes Section. The color completely drained from Sergeant Beaumont's face. A cold sweat broke out across his forehead. He stared at the ID as if it were a live hand grenade with the pin pulled. Assistant United States attorneys were the apex predators of the legal food chain. They didn't just prosecute criminals, they prosecuted police departments. They handled civil rights violations. They possessed the power to initiate federal probes that could dismantle entire precincts, force police chiefs into early retirement, and send dirty cops to federal penitentiaries. And the man in the photo wasn't just a low-level line prosecutor, he was a deputy chief. "Oh, sweet Jesus," Beaumont whispered into the empty booking area. He frantically looked over at the arrest report Carver had hastily started typing on the adjacent terminal. Suspect matched description. Refused ID, resisting arrest. It was a textbook boilerplate lie used to justify a bad stop. Beaumont knew it. Every cop in the building knew it. But this time, Carver had used it on a man who literally taught seminars on how to dismantle those exact lies in federal court. "Carver!" Beaumont yelled, his voice cracking with panic. He stood up so fast his office chair rolled backward and slammed into a filing cabinet. "Carver, get your ass out here right now!" Officer Carver strolled out of the break room, a fresh cup of coffee in his hand, looking annoyed by the shouting. "What's the problem, Sarge? The guy throwing a tantrum?" Beaumont didn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at the open wallet resting on the counter. Carver walked over, a smirk playing on his lips. His voice died in his throat. He looked down at the gold shield. He looked at the ID card, the name, the title, the federal seal. The mug of coffee slipped from Carver's hand, shattering against the linoleum floor, splashing dark brown liquid across his polished black boots. The silence in the booking area was deafening, broken only by the dripping of the spilled coffee. "Tell me," Beaumont said, his voice dropping to a terrified whisper. "Tell me you didn't put hands on him, Vance. Tell me you just asked him to come down here voluntarily." Carver stared at the badge, his tough guy facade crumbling into dust. He remembered the physical shove against the glass. He remembered the tight handcuffs. He remembered slapping the back of the man's head. I cuffed him, Sarge," Carver stammered, feeling the ground opening up beneath his feet. "I tossed him in the back of the cruiser. I told him to shut his mouth." Beaumont closed his eyes, rubbing his temples as a massive migraine bloomed behind his eyes. The precinct was dead. They were all dead. "Get the captain," Beaumont breathed. "Wake him up. Call the chief. Call everybody." He paused, panic rising. "What do we do about the guy?" "Don't you go anywhere near that cell," Beaumont roared, his fear morphing into rage. "You don't speak to him. You don't look at him. You just brought the wrath of the United States federal government down on this entire department. You stupid son of a—" In holding cell 3, Quentin Whitaker sat in the dark, listening to the muffled, chaotic shouting echoing down the hallway. He leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall. A small, grim smile finally touched his lips. The trap had closed. Now the real work would begin. Captain Elias Grant was a man who valued his sleep. When his bedside phone rang late that night, he answered it with the gruff irritation of a man used to dealing with drunks in minor domestic disputes. Minutes later, Grant was speeding down the frozen interstate in his unmarked vehicle, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, emergency lights flashing silently into the black night. When Grant burst through the double doors of the precinct, the atmosphere was suffocating. It felt less like a police station and more like a bunker moments before an artillery strike. Sergeant Beaumont was pacing behind the booking desk, sweating profusely. Officer Vance Carver was sitting on a metal folding chair in the corner, staring blankly at the linoleum floor. "Where is he?" Grant demanded, his voice a low, dangerous gravel. He didn't ask for a summary. Beaumont had already told him the catastrophic details over the phone. "Holding cell 3. "Captain," Beaumont croaked, his hands shaking as he held out a ring of heavy brass keys. "He hasn't made a sound, hasn't asked for a lawyer, hasn't asked for a phone call." "Of course he hasn't asked for a lawyer, you idiot," Grant hissed, snatching the keys. "He is the lawyer. He's the guy who puts away cartels and dirty politicians. He's sitting in there building a federal indictment in his head." Grant turned his furious gaze to Carver. "You do not move. Do not speak. You don't text your union rep. You don't call your wife. You breathe when I tell you to breathe. If I find out you scrubbed your body camera footage, I will personally throw you off the roof of this building." Grant straightened his uniform, took a deep breath to steady his racing pulse, and marched down the green-tiled hallway. The air grew colder the closer he got to the cells. He stopped in front of cell 3. Through the rusted iron bars, he saw Quentin Whitaker. The deputy chief of the violent crimes section was sitting perfectly still on the metal bench, his hands resting on his knees. He looked up as Grant approached, his expression utterly blank. "Mr. Whitaker," Captain Grant started, his voice strained with forced diplomacy. He fumbled with the keys, his hands betraying his panic. There has been a colossal misunderstanding. I am Captain Elias Grant, the commanding officer of this precinct. I am opening this door right now, and you are free to go. With our deepest, most profound apologies. The heavy deadbolt clicked. The iron door swung open, screeching on its hinges. Quentin did not stand up. He did not move toward the open door. He simply sat there, his dark eyes locking onto the captain's face. Captain Grant, Quentin said, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely terrifying. Are you unarresting me? Grant swallowed hard. Yes, sir. You're completely free to go. We'll have an officer drive you home immediately, anywhere you want to go. I see, Quentin replied slowly. And under what legal authority was I detained, transported, and locked in this cage? It was a mistake, sir. The officer— A mistake is a typo on a parking ticket, Captain, Quentin interrupted, his tone chillingly polite but slicing like a scalpel. What your officer engaged in was an unlawful seizure under the Fourth Amendment, a deprivation of my civil rights under color of law in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 242 and felony battery. He detained me without reasonable suspicion, arrested me without probable cause, and physically assaulted me because I asked him to articulate his legal reasoning. Grant wiped the sweat from his brow. Mr. Whitaker, please, let's step into my office. We can get you some coffee, get your belongings. I'm not stepping into your office, Captain, Quentin said, finally standing up. He stepped into the light of the hallway, and Grant winced as he saw the angry red indentations on Quentin's wrists where the cuffs had bitten into the skin and a faint red bruise forming on his left cheek from the bus shelter glass. I want my release processed officially, Quentin commanded, stepping into the corridor. I want a copy of the booking sheet showing the time I was brought in. I want the property receipt. I want the CAD dispatch log for the initial stop, and I want the badge number of the officer who assaulted me. I will not be slipping quietly out the back door so your department can sweep this under the rug. Grant knew he was cornered. Complying meant handing over the exact documentation Quentin would use to crucify them in civil court. Refusing meant escalating an already radioactive situation with a federal prosecutor. Of course, sir, Grant conceded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. I'll have the desk sergeant prepare the paperwork immediately. Minutes later, Quentin stood at the booking desk. He methodically dressed himself, slipping into his Tom Ford suit jacket, adjusting his collar and placing his gold badge back into his leather bag. The transformation was striking. He went from looking like a street-level suspect to a man who commanded empires. He took the stack of papers Sergeant Beaumont, trembling, handed over. Quentin read every single line before folding them neatly into his breast pocket. He then looked directly at Officer Carver, who was still sitting in the corner, pale and trembling. "Officer," Quentin said. The room went dead silent. In my line of work, I see a lot of bad men, but the ones who hide behind a badge to bully people on the street, they are my absolute favorite to prosecute. Get a very good lawyer. Without another word, Quentin Whitaker turned and walked out the front doors of the precinct, disappearing into the freezing night. The next morning, the sun rose over a city blissfully unaware of the legal earthquake that was about to hit. Quentin walked into the United States courthouse. He bypassed his own office and took the private elevator straight to the top floor. He walked past the shocked administrative assistants and pushed open the heavy oak doors to the office of Victor Langford, the United States Attorney for the District of Massachusetts. Langford, a silver-haired legal veteran with a reputation for political ruthlessness, was sipping coffee and reading the morning briefing. He looked up, surprised. "Quentin, you look like you went 10 rounds with a freight train. What happened to your face?" Quentin dropped his leather messenger bag onto Langford's mahogany desk. "Victor, I need a leave of absence. Effective immediately." Langford frowned, setting his coffee down. "A leave? We're impaneling the grand jury on the waterfront corruption case soon. You can't just walk away. What's going on?" Quentin sat down and laid out the events of the previous night with the dispassionate, clinical precision of a medical examiner detailing an autopsy. He described the stop, the assault, the ride to the station, and the panic at the booking desk. By the time Quentin finished, Langford's face had turned a mottled, furious red. He slammed his hand flat on the desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. "They did what? To my deputy chief? To a citizen?" "Victor," Quentin corrected softly. "They did it to a citizen. It just happened to be me." "I'm calling the mayor right now," Langford barked, reaching for his phone. "I'm calling the chief of police. I'll have that officer's badge on my desk by noon, and I'll have the FBI open a civil rights probe." "No," Quentin said firmly. "If you do that, it becomes a political favor, a quiet firing behind closed doors to appease the U.S. Attorney's Office. The department learns nothing. The public sees nothing. And tomorrow night, another black man in a hoodie gets his face slammed against the glass." Langford paused, his hand hovering over the receiver. "So what's your play, Quentin?" "I'm stepping back from my federal duties to avoid a conflict of interest. I'm hiring private counsel, and I'm going to sue the city, the police department, and Officer Vance Carver for a sum so catastrophically large that they will have no choice but to accept a federal consent decree overhauling their entire patrol division." Langford leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. 3 hours later, Quentin was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of attorney Preston Caldwell. Caldwell was the most feared civil rights attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, a man who had extracted hundreds of millions of dollars from corrupt municipalities and possessed a theatrical flair for media warfare. "They messed up, Quentin. They messed up on a biblical scale," Caldwell said, pacing the length of the conference room, energized by the details. "We hit them with a 42 U.S.C. section 1983 lawsuit. We claim false arrest, excessive force, malicious prosecution, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I want the systemic issues addressed, Preston," Quentin warned. "This isn't just about a payout." Carver was confident. He didn't think twice about lying on the arrest report. That means he's done it before, and his supervisors have signed off on it. We will rip their internal affairs records wide open during discovery. But the police department wasn't going to roll over and die. Within days, whispers began leaking to the local press, orchestrated by the aggressive local police union. Anonymous sources claimed that Quentin was acting erratically, that he matched the description of a violent felon, and that the physical force used was minimal and within department guidelines. They were trying to control the narrative. They claimed Carver's body camera had malfunctioned during the initial encounter, a convenient, predictable lie. They didn't know Quentin was already 3 steps ahead. The day after his release, while the police department was frantically trying to get their story straight, Quentin had quietly hired a private investigator to execute a preservation letter to the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority. The police forgot about the bus. When the bus had pulled up to the stop, its high-definition, forward-facing security camera had a perfectly clear, brightly lit view of the entire bus shelter. Days after the arrest, Preston Caldwell held a press conference on the steps of the federal courthouse. Every major news network was present. Microphones bristled on the podium. Behind Caldwell stood Quentin Whitaker, wearing a pristine navy suit, his face calm and unreadable. Last Tuesday, a distinguished federal prosecutor was treated like a violent animal simply for standing at a bus stop, Caldwell thundered into the microphones, his voice echoing across the plaza. The police union has spent the last week lying to the public. They claim Mr. Whitaker was aggressive. They claimed the officer's body camera was broken. They claimed the use of force was justified. Caldwell smiled, a shark smelling blood in the water. He gestured to a large television screen set up next to the podium. "We don't need their broken body cameras. We have the truth." Caldwell hit play. The high-definition video from the transit bus played for the assembled press. There was no audio, but the visuals were damning. It showed Quentin standing peacefully, hands visible. It showed Carver lunging unprovoked. It showed the brutal slam into the glass. It showed absolute compliance from Quentin and total unchecked aggression from the officer. Gasps rippled through the press corps. Camera shutters fired in a deafening crescendo. "Today," Caldwell announced over the noise, We are filing a $4.7 million civil rights lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Officer Vance Carver. Furthermore, we are formally petitioning the Department of Justice to investigate the systematic, racially biased policing practices of this department. The trap hadn't just closed, it had snapped the department's credibility in half. The war had officially begun. The video broadcast across the national news acted as a lit match dropped into a powder keg. Overnight, the narrative flipped from a local dispute into a national scandal. The city's crisis management PR firm was drowning, and the police union's bluster evaporated the moment the high-definition transit video hit the internet. But public outrage was only the opening salvo. The real execution was scheduled for a morning exactly 4 months after the arrest inside the sterile, glass-paneled conference room of Preston Caldwell's downtown law firm. It was time for the depositions. Sitting across the long mahogany table was Bradley Whitman, the chief litigator for the city. Whitman was a brilliant, pragmatic attorney who had made a career out of putting out fires started by reckless cops. But looking across the table at Preston Caldwell and a stone-faced Quentin Whitaker, Whitman knew he wasn't here to win. He was here to minimize the bleeding. Next to Whitman sat Officer Vance Carver. Carver had aged years in those months. He had been placed on unpaid administrative leave following the press conference, stripped of his badge and his gun. He looked pale, wearing an ill-fitting gray suit, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Every time he glanced at Quentin, he quickly looked away. Quentin simply sat with his hands folded, watching Carver with the cold, unblinking intensity of a hawk circling a wounded rabbit. A court reporter sat at the head of the table, fingers hovering over her stenotype machine. "State your name for the record," Caldwell began, adjusting his glasses. "Derek Vance Carver," he mumbled. "Speak up for the reporter, please," Caldwell instructed sharply. For the next several hours, Caldwell walked Carver through the agonizing minutiae of his career, his training, and the night in question. Caldwell was a surgeon with his questions, slowly boxing Carver into a corner built entirely out of the officer's own sworn police reports. "Officer Carver," Caldwell said, pulling a document from a thick manila folder. "In your official arrest report, you stated that you approached Mr. Whitaker because he perfectly matched the description of a suspect wanted for a string of residential burglaries in the area. Is that correct?" "Yes," Carver answered defensively. "Dispatch put out a bolo for a black male, tall, wearing dark winter clothing." "And you believed Mr. Whitaker, who was standing at a brightly lit public bus stop reading an email on his phone, was actively fleeing a burglary?" "And you saw, I had reasonable suspicion to initiate an investigatory stop," Carver recited, clearly parroting Whitman's coaching. Caldwell smiled, a terrifying, predatory grin. He reached into his briefcase and produced a thick stack of paper bound with a blue legal cover. He slid it across the table. "Exhibit C, Mr. Whitman, for your review." Whitman frowned, flipping open the document. "Officer Carver," Caldwell continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. "This is a certified transcript of the central dispatch logs for the district on the night in question. Let me direct your attention to the entry, time-stamped minutes before you activated your emergency lights and approached my client." Carver swallowed hard. The silence in the room suddenly felt heavy, suffocating. "According to this log," Caldwell read aloud, "the burglary suspect had already been apprehended. Dispatch broadcast this apprehension on the primary tactical channel, the exact channel your radio was tuned to. Dispatch cleared the BOLO." Whitman closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. He hadn't seen this. The police department had buried the dispatch log. "Officer Carver," Caldwell leaned across the table, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You knew the suspect had already been caught. You knew the BOLO was canceled. You had absolutely zero legal justification to stop my client. You didn't stop him because he matched a description. You stopped him because you wanted to harass a black man in a hoodie who had the audacity to exist in your patrol sector. Isn't that right?" I didn't hear the radio call," Carver stammered, sweat beading on his upper lip. "It was noisy. My radio volume must have been down." "Your volume was down?" Caldwell countered instantly, producing another sheet of paper. Then how did you respond to a status check from dispatch on that exact same channel? You acknowledged the apprehension of the suspect, Officer Carver. I have the audio recording. Carver's face drained of all color. He looked at Whitman for help, but the city attorney was staring a hole through the mahogany table. Let's move on to this body camera, Caldwell said relentlessly. You claimed in your sworn internal affairs statement that your Axon body camera malfunctioned during the physical altercation, that it shorted out due to the cold. That's what happened, Carver insisted, his voice trembling. Technology fails. Quentin Whitaker finally shifted in his seat. He leaned forward, locking eyes with Carver. The sheer contempt in Quentin's gaze made Carver physically shrink in his chair. Officer Carver, Caldwell said, we subpoenaed the metadata logs directly from Axon Enterprises, the manufacturer of your camera. According to the internal software audit, the camera did not short out. The camera did not experience a battery failure. It was manually powered down exactly seconds before you stepped out of your cruiser to assault my client. The power button was held until the unit disengaged. A collective gasp seemed to suck the air out of the room. Spoliation of evidence. Intentional destruction. It wasn't just a civil rights violation anymore, it was a federal crime. You turned it off, Caldwell stated, not asking a question. You turned it off because you knew exactly what you were about to do, and you didn't want a record of it. You just didn't count on the bus arriving right on time. Objection, Whitman interrupted weakly, though he knew it was pointless in a deposition. Counsel is badgering the witness. I'm finished, Caldwell said, slamming the folder shut. Mr. Whitman, I suggest we take a brief recess. I believe you and your client have some very difficult realities to discuss. As Caldwell and Quentin stood up to leave the room, Quentin paused by the door. He looked back at Carver, who was now trembling uncontrollably, his career, his freedom, and his life reduced to ash. I told you, Quentin said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like glass. You had no idea what you had done. The collapse of the city's defense was absolute and spectacular. Weeks after the deposition, the mayor personally requested an emergency mediation session. The city was facing a financial and public relations apocalypse. If Caldwell took this case to a federal jury with the dispatch logs, the Axon metadata, and the transit video, the damages wouldn't just be millions. A jury would award far more just to punish the department. The mediation took place in a neutral, high-end arbitration facility overlooking the harbor. The mayor, the chief of police, and Bradley Whitman sat on one side. Quentin and Caldwell sat on the other. The mayor looked exhausted. Mr. Whitaker, Mr. Caldwell, the city is prepared to admit fault. What happened to you was a disgrace. We are prepared to offer a settlement of $1.5 million tax-free, contingent upon a standard non-disclosure agreement. We want to make this right, and we want to move forward. Preston Caldwell didn't even look at his notes. He simply looked at Quentin. For the first time in the mediation, Quentin Whitaker spoke. Mayor, Quentin said, his voice calm, projecting the undeniable authority of a deputy chief prosecutor. Let me explain the reality of your situation. You are not buying my silence. You are not sweeping this under the rug with a nuisance payout and an NDA. I am a sworn officer of the United States Department of Justice. My duty is to the law, not to your municipal budget. Quentin slid a single sheet of paper across the table. These are my terms. There will be no negotiation. Whitman picked up the paper and read it. His eyes widened. First, Quentin continued, the financial compensation will be exactly $4.7 million, not a penny less. Second, Officer Vance Carver will be terminated immediately with cause, completely severing his right to a municipal pension. Third, Captain Elias Grant and Sergeant Lyle Beaumont will be forced into early retirement for failure to supervise and falsification of public records. The police chief shifted uncomfortably. Mr. Whitaker, we can't just dictate union pension terms. I strongly suggest you figure it out, Chief, Quentin cut him off instantly. Because if you don't, my fourth demand goes into effect. I will forward the unredacted discovery file from this civil case to the Civil Rights Division of the FBI. I will personally ensure they open a pattern or practice investigation into the precinct. They will put your entire department under a federal consent decree. They will dictate your hiring, your firing, your training, and your budget for the next decade. You will lose control of your own police force. The threat hung in the air, heavy and lethal. A federal consent decree was the ultimate nightmare for any mayor or police chief. It meant millions of dollars in compliance audits and total loss of autonomy. Quentin wasn't just holding a gun to their heads. He was holding a tactical nuke. $4.7 million, the mayor whispered, staring at the paper. Quentin, that's going to gut our discretionary fund for the year. Then next year, Quentin replied coldly, I suggest you spend your discretionary fund on teaching your patrolmen the Fourth Amendment. The silence stretched on for 2 agonizing minutes. Finally, the mayor picked up a silver pen, uncapped it, and signed the term sheet. It was over. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within days, the city announced the historic $4.7 million settlement. The terms were completely public. There was no NDA. Vance Carver was publicly fired. Days later, he was indicted by a federal grand jury for deprivation of rights under color of law and obstruction of justice for tampering with his body camera. He would eventually plead guilty to avoid a trial, receiving a multi-year sentence in a federal correctional institution. He lost his badge, his freedom, and his pension. Captain Elias Grant and Sergeant Lyle Beaumont quietly submitted their retirement papers, vanishing into obscurity, their reputations permanently tarnished. The precinct was gutted and overhauled, its command structure replaced by reform-minded officers terrified of federal oversight. As for Quentin Whitaker, the $4.7 million was wired into a trust. He donated a significant portion to a legal defense fund dedicated to providing high-powered representation for marginalized citizens who were victims of police brutality. He kept the rest. On a crisp morning, months after a dead car battery changed the course of his life, Quentin walked back into the United States courthouse. He took the elevator up, bypassed the administrative assistants, and walked into his office. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit perfectly. The heavy gold badge of the Department of Justice rested securely in his pocket. He sat down at his desk, opened a fresh case file, and picked up his pen. He was the deputy chief of the violent crime section, and he still had a lot of work to do. The story of Quentin Whitaker is a chilling reminder of how quickly power can be abused when officers believe they are operating in the dark. Vance Carver thought he had found an easy victim, someone whose rights he could crush without consequence. He learned the hard way that accountability can come from the most unexpected places. It's a powerful lesson in knowing your rights, standing your ground, and forcing a broken system to answer for its crimes. If this real-life legal takedown made your blood boil and your heart race, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with anyone who loves justice, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, true stories.